All rise, veuillez vous lever. The International Criminal Court is now in session. L'audience de la Cour pénale internationale est ouverte. Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
Thank you very much. Court officer, if you could kindly call the case again. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. President. Situation in the Republic of Kenya in the case of the prosecutor versus William Samoei Ruto and Joshua Arap Sang. Case reference ICC 0109-0111. And for the record, we are in open session.
Thank you very much. We are continuing the proceedings we started today. Are there any changes in appearances?
No, Mr. President.
Thank you very
same
much.
representation.
Thank you very much. And the defense?
No change, Your Honor.
None on my side.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kigen-Katwa, it's your turn to make your opening statement now. I know I didn't ask Mr. Khan yesterday when he spoke how long he was going to, but could you indicate for purposes of planning?
President, I'll take about 45 minutes with a possibility of getting into 1 hour.
Fair enough. You may proceed. Thank you.
Mr. President, Your Honors, my client, Mr. Sang, wishes to express profound solidarity with and sympathy for all the victims of post-election violence. This trial highlights another phase of their situation as victims to the extent to which the prosecutor did not conduct proper investigations in relation to this issue and to give redress to those victims. My client, Mr. Sang, does not belong to this court. Indeed, this is because he never belonged as alleged to any network. And we would like to underline at this point that we the allegations of organization. One is that the organization is constituted of the Kalenjin as a community. The second allegation, which is contained, the allegation in respect to the Kalenjin is what was alleged or stated by the prosecutor when they were making their opening address and in other circumstances. However, the pretrial brief, the public pretrial brief indicates that the allegation is founded on an organization in the name of the ODM. He never belonged to an organization which he served as a media liaison, whether it is ODM or Kalenjin, or served in a function of advertising meetings of illicit nature, or inciting the perpetration of crimes against either the Kikuyu or the PNU supporters, as the prosecution alleged. The picture painted of Mr. Sang, my client, by the prosecution does not resemble the real Mr. Sang, on the one hand, and in his intentions and actions in the period 2007-2008 around the unfortunate event of the violence. Mr. Sang, contrary to what the prosecution claimed, is a law-abiding citizen. He was instrumental in calling for peace and calm in the period of violence, and his character is greatly and extensively governed by the Christian values which he was brought up in. In short, he is innocent of contributing to the commission of the crimes charged us and has confidence in his innocence and his vindication. It is acknowledged that the allegation against Mr. Sang arises against an unfortunate backdrop of political competition, which has continued in Kenya and beyond to this court. The ICC process has been politicized since the beginning, and political opponents of his friend, Mr. Ruto, the first accused, have been capitalized on this forum as another way to frustrate his influence and his political career. At this point, I would like to reflect the concerns that Mr. Sang has asked me to especially address to Your Honors. The first issue that Mr. Sang would like to highlight is that the prosecution have disclosed some material to him, which includes some audio, some video, and some transcripts of what is alleged to have been broadcasted by him. All those materials, none of them reflect him as either advertising meetings for clandestine or illegitimate purposes, or inciting anybody to violence, or coordinating violence as alleged by the prosecution. And so as I speak before you, and being privy to the content of what has already been availed and disclosed to Mr. Sang, I can say as an absolute that none of the material that has been given to him contains those allegations. And he poses the question, and this is a question he poses as a very fundamental issue, as to whether it is possible or there is any likelihood of a conviction based on words of people whose character and integrity has been put to question in the name and style of the prosecution witnesses, vis-a-vis my client's insistence on his innocence, insistence on his integrity, and material available to show that he actually can support his contention that he is a person of integrity. And he struggles to understand whether or not it can be said that there is any case at all against him that has been maintained by the prosecution since the year approximately 2010. He struggles with the question whether the prosecution, in the absence of any material showing that he was either inciting or coordinating violence or advertising for meetings to plan violence, in the absence of any of those materials, whether it can be said that the prosecution have any prospects of proving their case beyond reasonable doubt, as they alleged yesterday morning when they were making their opening address. He poses the question to this court in the background of the fact that it is expected that the burden of proof is on the prosecution, and their burden is to discharge proof beyond reasonable doubt. It is our contention that the prosecution have not been able to bring any tapes to either support the allegation that he was inciting violence or coordinating violence or advertising for meetings, either because the prosecution have not looked for it, or they have looked for it, have them, and are withholding them. And if that were the case, then it must be because they are withholding them because it is inconsistent with the narrative that they would like to make. My client, Mr. Sang, is confident that he will make his case on the basis that of his confidence in his innocence, the extent to which he has been able to prepare witnesses, or rather to interview prospective witnesses, all of who were listeners of the CAS FM station, which he said to have broadcasted from, and all the assembly of all that material supports and reflects the fact that whether you interpret what he says expressly or by implication, he actually neither incited nor coordinated violence nor advertised for meetings as alleged by the prosecution. Mr. Sang prays very much that this court looks beyond the words of the prosecution witnesses and beyond the mere allegations they make, which is unsupported by any material whatsoever. On our part as his defense team, we have assured him that the standards of this court are international, that the court will that the judges are separate and distinct. in the judges that they beyond reasonable doubt and that they will look for real material that supports the allegation of the prosecution. At this point, I would request the permission of the court to play a tape that in a way reflects his character and his person.
Uchamege got up Kalenjin and wait to go meet bit. Uchamege got up Kalenjin and wait to go meet Uchamege got up Kalenjin and wait to go meet bit to Tabarani. Amajig to go stay up Kalenjin, Muang Aliot. Uchamege got up Kalenjin and wait to go meet bit to Tabarani. Amajig to go stay up Kalenjin, Muang Aliot, Tap Kaliet, Ninota Kurire, Metap Kenya Galiet. Rire chitukul galiet, rire lakwene mingin galiet, rire jitane o galiet, rire jebiosa galiet, rire boyo galiet, rire agui galiet, anabatiem, rire chitukul galiet, konyo ugalinjin, yabichi akobejit missing galiet.
My Lord, we had Your Honors, we had failed a transcript, the English translation. I don't know. Yes. It is on the screen, my Lord, Your Honor.
Do you see anything?
Your Honor, if you could press PC. I'm told it's available if you press the PC1.
PC1.
Your Honor, President.
Will this be part of the
It's
real?
It's the exact transcript of what is.
1 second.
Yes.
Confusion here. There must be some technical difficulty. I can't get it still. Sorry. Sorry about the interruption. Now we're back. I've got the transcript now. Thank you.
Uchamege got up Kalenjin and wait to go meet bit to Tabarani. Amajig to go stay up Kalenjin, Muang Aliot, Tap Kaliet, Ninota Kurire, Metap Kenya Galiet, Rire chitukul galiet, rire lakwene mingin galiet, rire jitane o galiet, rire jebiosa galiet, rire boyo galiet, rire agui galiet, anabatiem, rire chitukul galiet, konyo ugalinjin, yabichi akobejit missing galiet kumamigin sirei, galiet kumakin geji tukul. Kaliet kogojin bi kwai boisioni kwak. Kaliet kogojin chito kwai kit nemoche. Kaliet kogojin bi komengis eng tupchondit. Kaliet kuribe biik morogenso. Kaliet ko nemokyingei chitugul eng emetab Kenya eng kasari kimi. Kokobata ngalekab lewenisiet, kaliet ko kit kora nemoche kerib eng biik tugul eng chi age tugul nemi emetab Kenya neimuchi kwai kit age tugul nemanyolu inguni ama ribe kalyet anan iteweri kalyet kemeche kesa kalyet kele kaikai achek tugul ongerib kalyet ko kibikab Kenya ongerib kalyet eng wi tugul imite kalyet nekemoche biik tugul chekakekas kotala kele kabel biik kaniset nemi biik orit oye kotab kolenjin ngot ko biikab kolenjin chekae ngalek cheu cho komanyolchin chi age tugul kipkosabei boisiet neu noto makibele lakwa makibele chepyoso makibele chi neo amakibele chi nekakoume kotab Jehova ole kitorore kiptayat kakoit chito yoto kokakwo kocheng kiptayat kotuch inendet manyolu amanyolchin chi nesobei manyolchin chi age tugul kwai boisiet neu no akesome kele kalyet 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 kaikai asome kele kalyet kobun Kass FM kalyet nekemoche eng emetab Kenya urib kalyet chi age tugul korib kalyet neran rib kalyet boyo rib kalyet chepyoso rib kalyet ungiet sautik akeistoege kit age tugul neimuchi kobut kalyet neimuchi kongem emenyo bo Kenya eng kasari kimi kasarta notok nebichi mising kelen kalyet ko kit nemokyingei chi tugul kou noto ameche kesom chi tugul akosom chi tugul chi nesobei kele kalyet nekemokyingei emet nguni eng wi tugul imitei pelset ak ngemisiet ak barisiet komanyolchin chi age tugul nekiyae Jehova ingem ak itelel sobondop chi age nekiyae Jehova oistoege ki age tugul nengeme kalyet oistoege age tugul neimuchi kocher biik kwai tuguk chemanyolu noto ko ngoliot kobun Kass olen kaikai kotnyo kaikai kotab kitwek kutitab chego ungerib kalyet ungeistoege ngemisiet ungeistoege borisio age tugul neimuchi kwai chi kiplelutyo anan ko chi nesobei ungerib kalyet nguno agoi kalyet konyo.
Jonas and Mr. President, I would like to make out what he says in English, only parts of that are relevant for purposes of illustrating what kind of a person he is and what action he took in the year 2008. This tape is made around the period of 2nd of January 2008 and was pre-recorded after the events, the unfortunate events of Kiambaa Church, which is part of this case. And what he says that the first part of what he addresses when he makes the first address is that greetings Kalenjins wherever you are today. And when he says greetings Kalenjin, it has to be understood that this was a Kalenjin station and it was addressing itself to the Kalenjin community. Greetings Kalenjin wherever you are today. I would like to proclaim to you Kalenjin listeners a message of peace. That is, Kenya is crying for peace. Everyone is crying for peace. A little child is crying for peace. An adult is crying for peace. A woman is crying for peace. A man is crying for peace. A grandfather is crying for peace. So is a grandmother. Everyone is crying for peace. Our Kalenjin people, when it is so difficult, nothing compares to peace. Peace enables one to do whatever he or she likes. Peace enables people to live together in brotherhood. Peace dispels worry from people. Everyone longs for peace in Kenya at this time. Jonas, I would like to put some emphasis on that part where I've just read, where he says, peace enables one to do whatever he or she likes. Peace enables people to live together in brotherhood. And to underline that part where he asks for brotherhood, he is not saying a brotherhood amongst Kalenjins to the exclusion of anybody else. He goes on to say, elections are past. We should keep peace to all people or everyone in Kenya who may be engaged in wrongdoing and is not keeping peace or is breaching the peace. We would like to pray for peace. That, please, all of us, let's keep peace as Kenyan people. Let us keep peace wherever we are. Peace is what we need. All people whom we have heard about, including others that we heard, that people have burned a church, with people inside. Your Honor, this is a very direct reference to the KenyaMOJA Church, where it is alleged he was also involved in. All people whom we have heard about, including others that we heard that people have burned a church with people inside, or Kalenjin people. If it is the Kalenjin people who have done such acts, such an act should never be committed by a human being. No child should be banned, no woman should be banned, and no adult should be banned. No one who has sought refuge in God's house, where the Lord is glorified, should be banned. When a person has reached there, he has gone to seek the Lord to cover him. It is wrong and it is not befitting for any human being to engage in such an act. So we are pleading for peace. Peace, peace. Please, please, at KASFM, we are appealing for peace. The last bits that I wish to read are, wherever you are, banning, destruction, and killing should not be meted out on any person created by God. To destroy and cut short the life of a person created by God. Desist from any act that may destroy peace. Refrain from any act that may incite to do evil. That is the message from KAS, that please, please, let us keep peace. Let us refrain from destruction. Let us refrain from any killings and criminal or other persons may execute. Let us keep peace now and always. Peace, peace, our people. Your Honors, we have the recollection that the prosecution played some tapes and in the opening address. None of the tapes that were played related to Mr. Sang. We would have expected that if there was any material, that incriminates Mr. Sang, and we've always maintained that there is none. If there was any, the prosecution would have in part played it in the opening address. Your Honors, I also pray that three issues do emerge prominently from that audio that we've just played. The first one is the plea he makes for peace, including condemning what had happened in KenyaMOJA Church, and his plea that that is not a character of the Kalenjin people. Now, it is alleged that he was the one who was coordinating or mobilizing or marshalling Kalenjins to the violence that occurred. But here he is seen to be doing the exact opposite. The other issue I wish to highlight is his emphasis in his conviction in court. He says, whatever you are, banning, destruction, and killing should not be meted out on any person created by God. And lastly, he says he's making this plea for peace on his own behalf and on behalf of the station he was working at, that is KASFM. Your Honors, as evidence will show, whether on the part of the prosecution or on the part of the defense if we get there, it will become apparent that in fact Mr. Sang is not on record as doing any of the things alleged against him, and it's not so much because the prosecution didn't get it, but it is because it doesn't exist anywhere. In essence, we say that the prosecution has missed the purpose for which the statute was formulated, being to try criminal culpability. Instead, the prosecution has placed its resources and statutory privileges at the disposal of political competitors of my client's co-accused. We also contend that the case has focused a spotlight on the prosecution's duties under Article 54, but particularly its obligation to investigate exculpatory materials on an equal basis with incriminating material. This trial will be as much about Article 54 failings as it is about criminal culpability. To date, the prosecutor and her predecessor has not put her questions to the accused, Mr. Sang, and other people adversely mentioned. Your Honors will recall that the prosecution presented a certain chart where a number of people are mentioned, allegedly either serving in the function of financials or military arm of the organization and so on and so forth. And it is our contention that none of those people have been approached by the prosecution to ask their side of the story. And that poses the question as to whether or not the prosecution discharged or given attention at all to the requirement that they also investigate exculpatory material. The accused offered the prosecution an opportunity to ask him his side of the story. For reasons unknown to the defense, the prosecution avoided taking up the option. Mr. Sang suspects that this was because the prosecutor feared that Mr. Sang's narrative would be inconsistent with the prosecutor's wishes. Mr. Sang is aware that the first accused went as far as his co-accused, went as far as seeking to meet the prosecution at his own cost, to no avail, as the prosecution avoided asking him questions which culminated in this trial. As to the people the prosecution set out in her chart to illustrate the existence of a network, it is unfortunate that they came to learn of existence of their names for the first time when the prosecutor announced their names, and they were never given a chance to defend themselves and to demonstrate their innocence or to show that, in fact, the allegations made against them cannot be true on basis of the material they would have to show their innocence and their unavailability for the network. Arab Sang says that this trial deliberately addresses, Mr. Sang praised that in the course of this trial, this court kindly deliberately addresses the question of whether or not it can be said that the prosecution has discharged its Article 24 obligation to investigate exculpatory material if the suspects and other people adversely mentioned have not been invited to respond to the allegations proffered by the prosecution. And our insistence that adequate investigations were not done is supported by the fact that when the current prosecutor visited Kenya, she was told to her face that, in fact, when she visited Kenya for outreach purposes, she was told to her face that no investigations had been done and nobody had come to inquire from them what had happened. It is of significant importance to us to observe that it was said
Mr. Keegan Katwa, the interpreters they will need you to slow down so they can interpret properly.
I was just putting emphasis on the fact that when the prosecutor visited Kenya for outreach purposes, it was put to him directly that no adequate investigations had been done by the people who are said to be victims of this violence and whose victimhood we do not contest. Those same people observed that, in fact, Mr. Sang was not deemed to have been one of the people who are culpable. And so the material that the prosecution has against Mr. Sang, their source is perplexing. The prosecution does not have a case against Mr. Sang, nor does it have a case against the Kalenjin network. This explains why the case has mutated to a point where the current case has changed in many details from the prosecution's original case. For instance, the aggressors and the victims kept changing. In the prosecution's original case in December 2010, the network was allegedly responsible for committing crimes against murder predominantly within 25 kilometers from the house owned by Mr. Ruto in Sugoi, where he allegedly held meetings to plan violence. When the prosecution realized that there were no deaths and all the neighbors of Mr. Ruto were intact, and 3 years down the line, in September 2013, as we stand trial now, the allegations have changed into that the violence was meted out in Uasin Gishu and Nandi districts by Kalenjins, and not by ODM, as the prosecutor did in her opening address. And that the targets were Kikuyus, Kisis, and Kambas, which is at variance with the original case that the targets of the attacks were limited to Kikuyus and Kisis in the year 2010. It was also originally alleged by the prosecution that the target of the violence was to influence the elections of the year 2007. When we appeared in the pre-confirmation hearings and demonstrated that the violence happened after the elections had been done, the prosecution changed their story and in the close of that confirmation proceedings said that the objective of that violence was the 2013 elections. The 2013 elections have come and passed, and now the prosecution in their amended charges do not have a time target. So today the question remains, why would Sang and others create a network to stir up violence? What was their motive or interest or purpose in doing so? The prosecution says that Mr. Sang sought to exploit the historical tensions between Kalenjin and Kikuyu for his own political and personal ends. The defense say there is none. There were no political ends he sought, there were no personal ends he was seeking. And there was no benefit he would get from that violence. The defense, why would it be in Mr. Sang's own political and personal interest to seek to exploit these historical tensions? What was there to gain for him personally? The defense say nothing. Why is Mr. Sang here waiting for trial to commence before the ICC? The defense admits that while there may have been political reasons for targeting Mr. Ruto in case 1 and Mr. Kenyatta in case 2, Sang was the unfortunate victim of unfortunate collateral damage. The prosecution needed an even number on both sides in case 1 and 2. And being a popular presenter at KAS FM, a major Kalenjin radio station, the prosecutor pointed out in her opening address, Mr. Sang was so unlucky as to become the third suspect on the Kalenjin side. Until almost 3 years after his name was publicly disclosed at the ICC, as an ICC suspect, the case against him remains empty. And as earlier explained, there is no material against him to contradict his position that he is innocent, that his integrity is intact, and that there is no material to displace what he has always maintained. When the prosecutor landed in Kenya to conduct the investigation, his predecessor came into contact with some Kenyan political brokers, civil societies, civil societies, and some ethnic-minded individuals who wished to use the ICC to shape Kenya's political future. The people the prosecution met were opportunists, and who seized the chance to use ICC process for their own purposes. The NGOs joined in their disparate desire for donor funding and strove to find ways to make themselves relevant, exploited the difficult situation of victims, and took it upon themselves to protect prosecution witnesses. Some of the donors readily resourced the efforts of the NGOs, as it was a subject that easily attracted allocation of funds from humanitarian perspective. Potential witnesses then seized on the opportunity to further their own lives and circumstances with little regard for conscience or consequences. Economic circumstances and possibility of profit through participation in this case has influenced the content of the witness testimony and has encouraged the provision to the prosecution of false testimony. It would seem that the prosecution was eager to cooperate with these disgruntled sectors of Kenyan society and their foreign well-wishers. What has resulted is a marriage of convenience that has lasted to date. We submit that the prosecution should have been aware of these undercurrents and made more conscious effort to remain neutral and independent and not to be used as pawn of Kenyan politics. The prosecution has subsequently used the allegation of witness security and witness welfare matters to attract donor funds through partner organizations. The prosecution has not been very forthcoming with disclosure of expenses incurred on behalf of the witnesses, and this makes it more difficult for your honors to assess their candor. We trust that in the course of time, this will come out. As it turns out, it is evident that the witnesses were collected by political forces and NGOs, and this forms the core of the prosecution's case. The prosecution relies on the representations made before domestic processes dealing with post-election violence, as well as assertion, and it's the same assertions that are made in this court. However, the prosecution has failed to sufficiently investigate its own witnesses as a separate issue and their motivation for participation in this process. As a consequence, the prosecution has assembled witnesses whose personal integrity and truthfulness is in question. And Mr. Sang prays that this chamber stays alive to the question of credibility of these witnesses. For instance, it will be observed that the prosecution witnesses seem to have the superhuman characteristics of being omnipresent and having infinite resources. They claim to have traveled extensively to all meetings and rallies. They have access to cameras, video equipment. They can use guns, bows, arrows, and seem to listen to Sang's radio program on KAS FM despite having expressed disapproval and on full-time basis. Mr. Sang submits that it is unrealistic and undermines the credibility of these witnesses, these characteristics that these witnesses claim to have. Mr. Sang prays that the court gives attention to the quality of the prosecution witnesses. If the violence took place, if it was planned, if it was organized, if it was coordinated, there should be professionals and other peoples in the ranks of the witnesses, including, for instance, teachers, policemen, doctors, lawyers, and etc. At the close of the case, we will invite a reflection on the question of whether... Yes, Your Honor.
Watch the pace.
Okay, Your Honor. At the close of the case, we will invite a reflection on the question of whether the witnesses are a fair representation of Kenya as a society, as a whole, and or a fair sampling of the Kalenjin community who constitute the bulk of the so-called linkage witnesses and organization. We would also like attention to the fact that all linkage witnesses are associated with the political party at that time, PNU, Party of National Unity. A reasonable person could therefore question the bias and political motive of such witnesses. We would have expected the investigations could have paid careful attention to this aspect before relying on such witnesses to parade Mr. Sang before this court for trial. It would seem that the prosecution preferred to maintain a blind eye to this aspect. Mr. Sang has been formally charged in this court. Essentially, the prosecution alleges that Mr. Sang participated by contributing to the criminal activity of an organization, fakely the network. This network is purportedly organized in an hierarchical structure and has capacity to cause widespread and systematic harm. The prosecution claims that the network is comprised of 5 components from their chart yesterday: political, traditional elders, financiers, media, and military. That was the structure they presented, the chart they presented yesterday. The prosecution, through their witnesses, says the post-election violence crimes were organized around pre-existing traditional Kalenjin rituals and structures. And those are the words of the prosecution. This includes Kalenjin circumcision ceremonies, Kalenjin marriage engagements, Kalenjin elders, related process of inauguration into being a Kalenjin elder. It included Kalenjin women. It included Kalenjin leaders. It included Kalenjin athletes. It included Kalenjin soldiers. It included Kalenjin businessmen, Kalenjin professionals. Even an entity called a MA, which is part of the prosecution case, the only extensive investment vehicle available to common people amongst the Kalenjins, has been put to trial. From time to time, and this is inconsistent to what the prosecution have attempted to do and what they actually attempted to do at the press event that we had on the first day, on the 9th. From time to time, the prosecutor has attempted to explain unsuccessfully that what is on trial are individuals, and emphasis is on individuals, and not a community. However, the prosecutor's opening address yesterday morning suggests the exact opposite. The prosecutor said, and I will quote him verbatim, I said verbatim for emphasis. Politically, Mr. Ruto's associates within the network included prominent and influential local politicians and community elders. And community that is used by the prosecutor there is later on explained. The prosecutor went on to say this. They gave their endorsement to the plan by appearing at public rallies and supporting Mr. Ruto's rhetoric, as well as contributing to his war chest. Financially, the network received funding from wealthy Kalenjin businessmen and community foundations. And the community foundation here is EMAS, is later on explained. Then he goes on to say, the network drew on existing tribal structures to strengthen and legitimize its existence and objective. The network drew on existing tribal structures, and that is Kalenjin structures, to strengthen and legitimize its existence and objective. He went on to say, traditional Kalenjin elders endorsed and placed Mr. Ruto as their leader in 2006, as we have just seen, and that is in reference to the tape that was played. They exploited tradition. They contributed funding and recruited youth to take part in attacks. They helped to corral people, I don't know what he means by corral, they helped to corral people to the preparatory meetings and acted as watchdogs on their community to ensure participation by every Kalenjin youth in the area. Meted out punishment for those that did not support William Ruto or his political party, such as public humiliation, flogging, and forcing them to pay penance in livestock, some of which were used to feed the warriors on the ground. And afterwards, they performed cleansing ceremonies to absolve the youths of any crimes they had committed during the violence. Therefore, Your Honors, I'm just quoting him still. Therefore, Your Honors, while it may have resembled a traditional state or a state-like organization, this ad hoc network nevertheless satisfies the requirement of an organization for the purposes of contextual elements necessary for crimes against humanity. Your Honors, we would like to observe at this point that inconsistent with the document containing charges against my client, alleging that the organization was ODM, it is very clear from the presentation of the prosecutor yesterday that what is on trial is actually a community, its structure and its structures. Your Honors, my client has asked me also to lament at the impression created of this community, that it is a community that is engaged in flocking and forcing people to pay penance by releasing livestock, that they are cheated into the impression of innocence by alleged cleansing ceremonies, and Your Honors, we will endeavor in both cross-examination and in our defense to show that this is farthest from the truth, and that the community, that the Kalenjin community described by the prosecution is everything except what the prosecution has said. In this regard, it is instructive to read some paragraphs of what is contained in the public pretrial brief. And I have picked only one aspect of the attack on the alleged edifice called the organization, being the aspect of their circumcision ceremonies. And this is what he said in the public pretrial brief at paragraph 71. In December 2007, a traditional circumcision ceremony and training for Kalenjin youths took place in Kapchumba near Huruma. This ceremony and training lasted throughout December. Another circumcision ceremony also took place at Chandoni in the forest. Approximately 10,000 people attended this month-long ceremony and training. The youths returned from this ceremony initiated as warriors and ready to fight. Then the public pretrial brief goes on at paragraph 122. Training was organized for Kalenjin youths to prepare them to participate in the attacks. Traditional circumcision ceremonies were used to train youths to use traditional weapons such as bows and arrows to administer oaths of secrecy, violations of which were punishable by death, and oaths to follow orders and the guidance of elders, and to perform blessings and sacrifices. Youths also received training specifically for purposes of post-election violence, including how best to burn down houses and how to leave any traces of evidence and use of firearms. Your Honors, it is extremely strange that it could be said by the prosecution that these ceremonies are used to train people on how to burn houses, together with all the allegations that it is a month-long ceremony in a community that takes their children to school and cannot afford a whole month for such a function. The prosecution has manipulated the culture of the edifice they refer to as the organization being the Kalenjin. They have manipulated the said culture and structures to feed awkwardly into the elements of crimes against humanity through a fictional network. In consequence, it appears that one becomes a criminal by virtue of being an African Kalenjin. The prosecution has put sinister spin on all aspects of Kalenjin culture, that the network exploited pre-existing structures, including circumcision, getting engaged to get married, state of being an elder, the age process of getting to become an elder. The prosecution also implicates Kalenjin women, Kalenjin athletes, retired Kalenjin members of military, or rather retired military people who are Kalenjins, Kalenjin businessmen, Kalenjin media entrepreneurs, and Kalenjin Foundation in the name and style of Emo. And in consequence of what I have just highlighted to you, Your Honors, being partly what the prosecutor said and partly what is contained in the public pretrial brief, it becomes very clear and apparent that what is on trial are not individuals. It is actually a community and its culture. It will be observed from the names that the prosecutor had in their chat yesterday, together with other materials that are contained in the substance of the public pretrial brief, that prominent Kalenjins who have held important positions internationally have also been roped in and their reputation tarnished. Such individuals include, but are not limited to, Ambassador Bethwel Kiplagat, who is mentioned in that public pretrial brief, General Lazarus Sumbeiwa, Dr. Kipchake Keino, Mr. Mika Jezerem, and others, including judges who are Kalenjin. Your Honors, some of the allegations made are extremely outlandish, to the extent, for instance, of saying that a foundation by the name Emo has a bank with financial resources in the sum of Kenya shillings 1.2 billion and own the biggest or the tallest building in the center of Nairobi. It is public knowledge, and the prosecution should have been able to notice this very easily if they had visited Kenya or if they had been diligent in their investigation, that the tallest building in Nairobi houses the Central Bank and Kenya Revenue Authority and is the Times Towers in Nairobi. There are other extremely outlandish issues which I do not want to raise at this point and we will raise in the course of trial. The Kalenjins that have been described by the prosecution are constituted of diverse ethnic groups, and they have wide-ranging political affiliations. They do not belong to one political entity, as the prosecution alleged. It is therefore lamentable that in this day and age, the prosecution is throwing the traditions and customs of entire people under the weight of criminal justice system when there are more deserving issues to which the prosecutor would have applied his attention to. As the prosecution puts it, Mr. Sang was a popular broadcaster on Kalenjin language station. We state that this program, Lene, which has been referred to, was a platform for the education of Kalenjin people on wide-ranging issues which affected their daily lives, such as farming, social morals, commerce, enterprise, politics, and legal issues. Listeners tuned in and called in to debate on such issues. It was just a platform to create an interactive opportunity for listeners in a vernacular language, and the use of the vernacular language is because they were familiar and comfortable with that language. It now seems that in part Mr. Sang is being punished for his efforts to bring together and consolidate the Kalenjin people on lawful and legitimate matters of political choices and entrepreneurship. Kalenjin expressions which may have been used during this program and which have been woefully misinterpreted by the prosecution and misunderstood by the prosecution have been given criminal meaning. However, the use of Kalenjin proverbs, metaphors, idioms, and others is part of any community's rich history. Such color to language exists in all cultures. Chinua Achebe, the renowned and celebrated author, has had occasion to explain that proverbs in communities are palm wine with which words are eaten. proverbs used in Kalenjin, Kalenjin proverbs, metaphors, and idioms used in Kalenjin should not be judged using Western standards or any other criteria that gives incorrect interpretation. Mr. Sang would like to pose the question as to whether anything remains in the name of the entity called Kalenjin if the two were to eventually be convicted owing to the existence of their culture and their lifestyle as postulated by the prosecution in criminalizing Kalenjin circumcision, Kalenjin marriage, and so on and so forth. The prosecution, in focusing its efforts on attempting to create a criminal Kalenjin network, allegedly which pre-planned violence to follow the 2007 election, has suppressed the effect of the disputed results of 2007 elections. It should not be forgotten that the successful or the person who was elected as the president in those elections was sworn in late in the night and after election observers had been locked out. It is also on record that the chief executive of the Electoral Commission then, the late Samuel Kifuitu, acknowledged long before there was any violence that if the elections were mishandled, there was a likelihood of resulting in violence. Your Honors, to the best of our knowledge, even the very least act of obtaining a statement from the late Mr. Kifuitu was not done by the prosecution. It remains Mr. Sang's position that post-election violence broke out as a spontaneous reaction to failed elections and irresponsible management of the situation by the Electoral Board in Kenya. The theory taken by the prosecution in this case gives no explanation to the occurrence of previous cycles of violence and other violent incidents occurring throughout the country. These include the 1952 emergency, the 1982 coup, 1992 general elections violence, and 1997 general elections violence. And at this point, Your Honors, I would like to invite the court to some important and significant issues. The first one is that the first accused, who is said to have been the part of the first accused, who is said to have been assisted, to have recruited the assistance of the second accused, my client, was not a contestant in the 1992 elections. Neither was he a contestant in the 1997 elections. Neither was he a contestant in the 2007 elections, together with the accused in case number one, Mr. Uhuru Kenyatta. We would pray that this is juxtaposed with the fact that in their attempt to participate in the elections in the year 2002, the two of them, that is the first accused in this case, and the accused in case number 2, when they lost elections in that period, in the year 2002, number one, Your Honors, they conceded defeat. That is a significant thing, Your Honor. The second one is that in that period, when they were contestants, there was no violence. Again, in the year 2012, when they were contestants, there has not been any violence, the elections that were just done early this year. Your Honor, the prosecution would probably want to attempt to argue that the 2013 elections attracted no violence because of the existence of this case. We would like to draw attention to the fact that in the year 2002, when the two of them were in the political arena, there was no ICC, there was no violence, and they had the grace to concede defeat. The allegations by the prosecution purporting that the first accused allegedly, with the help of the second accused, desired to evict Kikuyus and PNU and other non-Kalenjins from the areas referred to being the Rift Valley, the Uasin Gishu and Nandi district, is number one, illogical, considering that the first accused needed to get national leadership, and if he had to succeed, he needed to get at least 25% support of other tribes and constituencies. It would have been foolish on the part of the first accused to seek to get evictions and to still expect to get 25% votes in all other areas in Kenya to successfully obtain national leadership. It is also inconsistent with logic that whereas these charges relate to only one province, that is Rift Valley, the violence that occurred in the year 2007 was in 6 out of 8 provinces. This trial is an insult to Kenya government, the Kenyan people, the Kenyan institutions, the Kenyan judiciary, and Africa as a whole. If Mr. Sang was really on air broadcasting incitement, advertising for meetings to plan violence, and coordinating violence, when he was, as the prosecution have attempted to explain, he was speaking from the position of an opposition to the government, and when there was a ban on live broadcast, the question that arises is whether the prosecution wants this court to believe that he could, in the face of government ban and blackout on media live coverage, that he could do that and remain unarrested and unnoticed. The prosecution would have you believe that during post-election violence, with all Kenya Police, the Criminal Investigation Department, the National Security Intelligence Services, and provincial administration officials, on one hand, were all deaf to his words and unable to stop him when he was making all this incitement, coordinating violence, and allegedly advertising for meetings to plan violence. We have Mr. Sang here on trial. He is a confident Christian whose convictions is disposed to condemn commission of any crime, as was evident from the tape we just played, including murder, torture, and any actions that would cause destitution, as is reflected in the 3 counts against him. He has always stated and lived by his convictions. Prior to the tragedy of the prosecutor's interest in Kenya, he had never encountered any criminal process, even at the lowest level and at the smallest scales of his village in Seum in Kitale. He cannot, therefore, comprehend how he can be deemed to be an international criminal by the prosecution at international level when everyone who grew up with him knows him best, who knows him best, and who taught him in school, who associated with him in church, and all his colleagues at the media station where he worked, and other places he worked, together with his immediate and extended family, including his father, Mr. Keter, his mothers, E. Keter and L. Keter, and his wife, Trofena, and his children, that he respects the law and is a role model. All people who know Mr. Sang and who have afforded themselves a chance to meet him and interact with Mr. Sang mourn and regret what the prosecutions have alleged against him. He is a person who is more sinned against than sinning. Mr. Sang has been accused as having broadcasted all that has been alleged against him from the station Kass FM. And we would like to also highlight his place in that radio station. Mr. Sang was an insignificant individual who undertook his limited role as a journalist to give a platform to the public to learn, to make choices, to be entertained in Kalenjin dialect. In consequence of his modest performance, he gained respect and high regard of many people. His trial is conducted against the background of two important facts. The first one is that he was a junior staff member at the radio station. Number two, he was not a shareholder in the said radio station and did not share in the station's profit. He had no political clout. He obtained no benefit from this situation, this violent situation, and the only benefit he got in the course of his services at the station was his remuneration. Your Honors will of course know that he is on legal aid. He did not have free hand at the station to do what he wished to do. He was under supervision and under management. He had to follow the station's internal policies, procedures, and ethics. He has subsequently been forced to resign from KSFM because the prosecution continued to make allegations against him long after bringing him and arraigning him in this court. In January 2008, when the violence was raging, Mr. Sang, as I've already explained, not only preached peace but mobilized for peace. He himself and others at the car station pre-recorded peace messages which were played in compliance with government's ban on live broadcast, which was in force at that time. The allegation by the prosecution that he coordinated violence is false, as I've already explained. And at this point, I would like to play a tape to show his efforts to mobilize not only himself but others to endeavor for peace.
Kainenyu ko Bishop Sila Arabiego nebo ICC Kenya. Kanyo yu sikobit oib saet nebo kenyit nelel kesochi emoninyo bo Kenya ak mising bororienyo nebo Kalenjin eng betusiek chutokchu mi nyigisinwek cheterter ko kakibwa ak tupchosiekyuk checham keyoe saet kibagenge yekimi Nairobi sikobit kesoiwok bororioninyo bo Kalenjin akemwoiwo kele chok chome Jehova akomoche Jehova keyai tuguk chemyachen. Moche Jehova kenyoru kenyit nelel aketach eng boiboiyet neo asikobit konyor berurto lagokyok.
As that tape reflects what was done by three people, that is the first tape that we would like to play. In the same sitting, which was on 1st of January 2008, we would like also to play a second tape by a second person who was in the company of that person.
Ane yu Bethwell Kiblagati ko kakibwa ak tupchesiek yu kakibwane saet mamigege nekebwane rani ako kakibwane saet kakitau kenyit neleli ko kekere kele ing betune brani ngalek yokikas kokinyoru kobunu emetab biikab Kalenjin ko kakonyikisitu mugulelwekyok kekose kelen in kabargei biik kakiamgei akutani makong'ololdos biik kokosyindosi ko kiit kityo nekakisome kuni ing iman ko kikebe kiawendot emotinwek chechang ak atoreti biik sikotuiyo kong'ololso biik chekiboregei ngo olin kibo Sudani ango ko Mozambique ango ka chumareyu kokero eng television ng'ololjini bichu mutu kwanyun kit netai nemoche amwa koni mami chi eng sang neimuchi kokes ng'olyondoni ipkwek kandoik chebo emoni kandoikab Kalenjin kandoik chebunu Kenya tugul ko icheket as cheimuchi mami chi age neimuchi kwai boisioni kwanyun nguno kokosokose kelenin kimi biik kitieme mi barab Sumbeiwo ko boisiet nekiyoe komelen kele kakicheng'e kenyoru in solution ng'alechu kit nekiyoe ko kakisoe akebeb kenyoru kimasini keng'ololji bichu keng'ololji kimasi age kechobochobi sikotuiyo bichu kimoche kotuiyo bichu akong'ololso.
Jonas would like to play the third tape.
Kochamegei biikab Kalenjin ane kekurono General Lazaro Arap Sumbeiwo. Kiami ain yu ang'ololwok eng betut nekimong'u tuguk chekibo boisiet. Ko kialechok omurnokiron ak omurneketa chepyosok singoityo komakiyai tugun cheyachen komakiyai tuguk cheyach. Komelen kile kiamwowok ale sikesarana kimandang'wong. Kiamwowok amu angen ole kiaboisie amite luget ale ngot kowoi kanam chito akotinye karik kotorene lagokchok. Kaangen nguno kokobka biik chekokimut konyo korib olonyonet. Kokokimut biik chetinye karik chekoromen. Karik chemelen kele amwowok chebo iman ale otebi eng kalyet ongetebi kou yo kakomwa tupchenyu Bethwel Kiplagat ako kakosa Bishop.
Jonas, that's one incident that was done on 1st of January 2008 at the initiative and instance of my client, Mr. Sang, who mobilized these three people to come and plead for peace. Jonas, three things I would like to observe from those steps. The first one is that the first person there, one Bishop Silas Yeko, belongs to a church by the name AIC, African Inland Church. This is approximately the second biggest church in Kenya, and his voice carries weight. The second person there, one Ambassador Bethwel Kiplagat, he is a very achieved diplomat and who's assisted in obtaining peace in Sudan, in Mozambique, and in Somalia. The third person there, one General Lazarus Sumbeiwa, retired.
1 second.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Kiginkatwa, I do not know whether you'd given the names to the stenographers, but it will help generally for purposes of proceedings that counsel spell names, place names and people's names so that it makes life easier for the stenographers as they write. Thank you.
Your Honor, we did provide those names. We did provide names, even in the transcript, Your Honor. Your Honor, I was explaining that the third individual there, one retired General Lazarus Sumbeiwa, is also an achieved diplomat who has his hand also in the peace that was obtained in Sudan and in Somalia. And Your Honor, I just want to put emphasis on the very conscious and deliberate action on the part of my client to seek out these individuals who carry influence and weight, to ask them to come and make their contribution in seeking for peace. Your Honor, we wish to submit that this reflects a person who was not given to violence, but who had every wish that there would be peace. Your Honor, all the three people seek that there be peace and pray for peace. They all ask that there be dialogue, and it is very significant what retired General Sumbeiwa says in his first paragraph, the first three sentences he makes, where he says, "Greetings, Kalenjin people. My name is Lazaro Arap Sumbeiwa. I was here the other day speaking to you the day the election results were released. I told you to enforce cultural restrictions on our actions, lest people engage in wrongdoing, lest we do evil." And Your Honor, I just want to put emphasis, Your Honors, I want to put emphasis on his plea not only in abstract, but also founded on culture, on the Kalenjin culture that the prosecution is putting on trial, where he says, I plead that you go back to your culture and observe that, in fact, in a cultural context, you wouldn't be seen to seek to engage in any criminal acts, including murder, deportation, and destitution, as the prosecution alleged. I wish to play the last tape in terms of my client's effort to plead for peace. This last tape is very significant because this reflects his relationship with the first accused and his effort to get and plead for peace. A completely diametrically opposite position from what the prosecution alleged.
Ko William Arap Ruto, jumbe na Eldoret no ameche ay baraini korong na tay amak chibiga pudi da Kalenjin na biga be metat Kenya. Kanit na lel net ni gaberuret a kita tu na ni engeni na lel na isuldoy awon biga gaberuret at Jehovah. Am ya ngodi biga pudi da Kalenjin ale ni ngoyandi o emek ni ngale tay ngale gabuchaguzi che koromen kiteme kengalal a ko biga bodiem David Kenyoru arngaleja tagen goret na bagaliet kita setay ke ngololi apik chemi emetab Kenya ak chemi emotinwek chebo sang kangalal Gordon Brown Prime Minister nebo Olimpo Britain ak Mheshimiwa Raila kangalal kora Mheshimiwa Raila ak biik chechang emotinwek cheterotin ketieme kecheng oret nebo iman nekitore ngalek kotestai eng ngalekab uchaguzi. Amache asom biikab Kalenjin tugul eng ole mi biikab emetab Kenya kemuite kemete boriet, kemete ngalek tugul chengeme kalyet eng emenyo nebo Kenya asikobit kecheng oret nebo kalyet nekitore ngalek chekomi akobit imanda nebo chitugul nebo birkura eng ngalekab lewenisiet nekosirto. Kitieme keboisie ortinwek chebo kalyet kecheng kenyoru imanda nebo biik chok ak nenyochek tugul biik chekokibir kura ko kimache kesom biik tugul.
Your Honors, the voice you've just heard, as must be familiar, is the voice of the first accused in his characteristic eloquence, pleading for peace. In part, he says that as ODM people, we are trying to talk so that we can solve these issues in a peaceful manner. And that, of course, is consistent with the whisper that we saw in the template yesterday. We continue to talk with people in the nation of Kenya and those from other countries. Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister of Britain, talked with Honorable Raila. Also, Honorable Raila talked with many people from different countries. We are trying to find a solution to the issues that transpired in the elections. I would like to appeal to Kalenjin people wherever they are and the people of Kenya to persevere and renounce violence. Let us desist from any actions that would ruin peace in our country, Kenya, so that we may find a peaceful solution to these issues and that every voter in the just concluded elections might find justice. We are trying to find a peaceful solution on behalf of the people, and all of us who voted, so that we would like to appeal to all people. Your Honor, I'm sorry I said the last step, but I have one more, Your Honor, and then that should be the last one. Your Honor, the last step represents my client's efforts to mobilize his colleagues at the Kass FM station to plead for peace at that time.
Before you play the tape, how much longer do you plan to go after the tape, noting that it is 11 o'clock now? Would that be the last in your opening statement, the last segment, or would you need some more time? Why don't we take the morning break here now then? Would it work with you? And then we'll come back at 11:30. Or would that be terribly inconvenient for your purposes?
No, it wouldn't be terribly inconvenient. Of course, if we could do another 15 minutes and get done, I would be happier. But if it's not possible, I'm okay with that, Your Honor.
Why don't we just rise for the morning break and come back, and then you can continue. Finish.
All rise. Veuillez vous lever.